Have you ever felt underestimated or judged unfairly? Like people didn't see your true potential? It's a feeling many of us can relate to, the frustration of being overlooked or dismissed. Today, we're diving into the extraordinary story of Sarah. A quiet high school student who kept to herself, rarely drawing attention. But everything changed one fateful afternoon when her math teacher, Mrs. Thompson, called her out in front of the entire class. With a smug expression, Mrs. Thompson pointed to an impossible equation on the board one even the top students couldn't solve and demanded Sarah take a shot. It wasn't just a challenge, it was a public test designed to mock Sarah, expecting her to stumble and fail. But what no one realized, not even Mrs. Thompson, was that Sarah wasn't just any quiet student. She possessed a genius-level IQ and a mind far sharper than anyone could imagine. What happens next will leave you stunned. Sarah didn't just solve the problem, she shattered every expectation in the room, leaving her classmates speechless and her teacher questioning everything she thought she knew. Stick around to witness Sarah's incredible transformation from the invisible girl to the one who redefined what it means to embrace your brilliance. Her journey will inspire you to confront your fears, break free from expectations, and show the world who you truly are. Don't miss this powerful story that could change the way you see yourself and others forever. The classroom was buzzing with restless energy as the final period of the day dragged on. The sun's golden rays streamed through the half-closed blinds, casting long shadows across the desks where students fidgeted, doodled, or whispered quietly to one another. At the front of the room, Mrs. Thompson stood with her arms crossed, her stern gaze enough to silence even the rowdiest students. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, a teacher who demanded respect and often used sarcasm as her weapon of choice. Today, however, there was something sharper in her tone, an edge of irritation mixed with smugness. In the back corner of the room sat Sarah, the quietest student in the class. She was the kind of girl most people didn't notice unless they had to. Her head was usually bent over her notebook, her dark hair hiding her face. She never raised her hand to answer questions, never engaged in the lively banter that others thrived on. Most of her classmates assumed she was just another average student, someone content to blend into the background. If anyone ever asked Sarah a question, it was only to confirm what they already thought: she wasn't special. But Sarah was anything but average. Beneath her quiet exterior was a mind that could analyze complex problems with astonishing precision, a genius-level intellect she had hidden for years. At the front of the room, Mrs. Thompson grabbed a marker and turned to the whiteboard, her movements brisk, with a dramatic flair. She wrote a sprawling equation that seemed to snake across the board. Numbers, symbols, and variables tangled into a monstrous challenge, one that even the most confident students dared not approach. This was a problem designed to intimidate, a puzzle that could easily stump college-level math majors. "Sarah," Mrs. Thompson called out suddenly, her voice sharp and cutting through the classroom buzz. Heads turned toward the back corner. The room fell into a tense silence as all eyes landed on Sarah, who froze in her seat. "Come solve it," Mrs. Thompson said, her tone laced with mockery. "Let's see what you've got." The class erupted into muffled whispers. Everyone knew this wasn't just about solving the equation, it was a test, a trap. Mrs. Thompson was daring Sarah to fail, to prove her point that the quiet girl in the corner wasn't worth noticing. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, with a deep breath, she stood, walking slowly toward the board. The tension in the room was electric, and the air felt heavy as if the entire class was holding its collective breath. As Sarah approached the whiteboard, her footsteps seemed to echo louder than they should in the silent room. Every pair of eyes followed her, filled with curiosity, doubt, and for some, outright amusement. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm, betraying none of the turmoil swirling within. Why now? Why her? The questions screamed in her mind. But she already knew the answers. Mrs. Thompson wanted to make an example of her. To prove that Sarah wasn't trying hard enough. Wasn't good enough. But it was more than that. This was about control. Mrs. Thompson's condescending smirk said it all. She didn't believe Sarah had any chance of solving the equation. Standing before the board, Sarah's gaze swept over the tangled mess of numbers and symbols. To most, it was an impenetrable labyrinth. To her, it was a puzzle waiting to be unraveled. But as her mind clicked into focus, the weight of her past rushed forward. Memories she had tried so hard to bury came flooding back. The first time her teachers noticed her brilliance, it had felt like a spotlight she couldn't escape. At first, there were praises, awards, and pride in her parents' eyes. But then came the whispers from classmates. The jealousy. The isolation. People didn't understand her, they feared her. Some called her a show-off. Others a freak. Even her own father seemed uneasy with her abilities, often reminding her to tone it down so she could fit in better. It didn't take long for Sarah to learn that being exceptional came at a cost. So, she stopped trying. She started blending into the background, keeping her head down, and letting people believe she was just another average student. It was safer that way. But now, standing here under Mrs. Thompson's sharp gaze, there was no hiding. This was a moment she hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. Any day now. Sarah, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice dripping with impatience. A few students snickered, and Sarah could feel their amusement prickling at her skin. She picked up the marker, her hand trembling slightly. The classroom seemed to close in around her, the air heavy with judgment. Taking a deep breath, she let her mind do what it did best. As Sarah began to write, the room fell eerily silent. The soft squeak of the marker on the board was the only sound. Step by step, her thoughts unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. What looked like chaos to everyone else was pure logic to her. Numbers fell into place. Patterns emerged. And solutions appeared as naturally as breathing. The students' initial amusement gave way to hushed whispers. Is she actually doing it? No way. She's just guessing. How is she even? Mrs. Thompson's smirk slowly morphed into a frown. She stepped closer to the board. Her arms crossed tightly. Sarah, she said sharply. You don't need to pretend. If you're stuck, just say so. But Sarah didn't falter. Her focus was unshakable now, her fear replaced by an intense clarity. She moved fluidly through the equation, each step building on the last. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations, each one falling perfectly into place. As she neared the final steps, the atmosphere in the classroom changed. The skepticism was still there, but it was tinged with something else: disbelief. Awe. Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through the tension again. Sharper this time. That's enough. Sarah. You've made your point. But Sarah ignored her. She wasn't doing this for Mrs. Thompson or her classmates. She was doing it for herself. For every time she had been told to shrink, to hide, to play small. This was her moment. And she wouldn't let it slip away. Finally, with a firm stroke of the marker, she wrote the last number and underlined it. The equation was complete. Sarah stepped back, her chest rising and falling as she turned to face the room. The silence was deafening. Mrs. Thompson stared at the board, her face a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "This can't be right," she muttered, pulling out her phone to double-check the solution. As the seconds ticked by, Sarah stood frozen, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. The whispers began again, louder this time. "She really did it? That's insane. I didn't know she was smart." Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted as she checked and rechecked the solution. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked up at Sarah with something resembling reluctant respect. "It's correct," she said, her voice strained. For the first time, Sarah let herself smile. A small but genuine expression. She wasn't just the quiet girl in the corner anymore. She was Sarah, the girl who had done the impossible. And for the first time, she felt ready to embrace who she truly was. Sarah stood back from the board, her hands trembling slightly as she held the marker at her side. The equation, once an intimidating monster sprawled across the whiteboard, now stood completely solved. The final line was underlined with a steady hand, a quiet but bold declaration of her success. The classroom was utterly silent, as if time itself had paused to take in what had just happened. Sarah turned to face her classmates, their expressions a mix of awe, confusion, and disbelief. It wasn't just the complexity of the problem that had stunned them, it was her. Mrs. Thompson, who had been standing rigidly near the board, stared at the completed equation as if it were written in a foreign language. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. Her once confident smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of pure disbelief. "This," Mrs. Thompson finally managed, her voice cracking slightly. "This can't be right." She snatched her phone from her desk, quickly typing the equation and Sarah's solution into a calculator. The room waited with bated breath, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. As Mrs. Thompson's fingers hovered over her phone, her eyes widened, her face flushed, her confidence visibly crumbling as she glanced from the screen to the board and back again. "It's correct," she muttered, barely audible. The moment hung in the air, heavy and charged. Whispers began to ripple through the class. "She really did it? That's insane. Since when could she do stuff like that?" Sarah met the eyes of her classmates, some filled with awe, others with a twinge of fear. They were trying to reconcile the quiet girl they had ignored for years with the brilliance that had just unfolded before them. Mrs. Thompson, however, wasn't ready to concede completely. "This was a fluke," she said, her voice sharp and defensive. "You must have seen this problem before. There's no way." Before she could finish, Sarah spoke, her voice calm but steady, cutting through the chaos. "I'm not your joke," she said, her words resonating with quiet power. "And I'm not here to make you feel comfortable. I am what I am." Her classmates fell silent again, the weight of her statement sinking in. It wasn't just about the equation anymore, it was about everything Sarah had been holding back. The years of hiding her true self because she was afraid of how others would react. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the pride bubbling up inside her. It wasn't arrogance or smugness, it was relief. Relief that she no longer had to pretend to be someone she wasn't. Mrs. Thompson seemed taken aback, her stern demeanor faltering. She looked at Sarah, then back at the board. As if trying to piece together how she had underestimated her so badly. The teacher's disbelief shifted into something softer, reluctant admiration. Sarah turned to face the class once more. All my life, I've been afraid of standing out, she said. Her voice stronger now. Afraid of what people would think if they knew the real me. But I'm done hiding. Her words hung in the air, resonating with a few of her classmates who nodded quietly. Their own experiences of self-doubt reflected in her story. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, the students began gathering their things. Their conversations filled with murmurs of what they had just witnessed. Sarah moved to her desk. Her heart still pounding but her mind strangely calm. For once, she didn't feel the need to disappear. On her way out of the classroom, she paused when she heard Mrs. Thompson call her name. Turning back, Sarah saw her teacher standing by the board. Her posture less rigid. Her expression almost apologetic. I underestimated you, Mrs. Thompson admitted. Her voice quieter than Sarah had ever heard it. I shouldn't have doubted you. You've got a gift, Sarah. And I hope you don't let anyone, including me, make you feel like you need to hide it. Sarah nodded, her chest swelling with pride. Thank you, she said simply. As she walked down the hallway, she could still hear the buzz of conversations behind her. Did you see that? She's some kind of genius. I can't believe we didn't notice before. But for the first time, Sarah wasn't listening to the voices around her. She was focused on her own, on the realization that she didn't have to hide anymore. As she stepped into the sunlight outside, she felt a strange lightness in her chest. For years, she had been afraid of what would happen if people knew the truth about her. Now, she wasn't afraid anymore. Sarah had proven to herself and everyone else that she wasn't just the quiet girl in the corner. She was someone who could do the impossible. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to embrace it. As Sarah walked through the school hallway, the echoes of whispers and murmured conversations followed her. Everywhere she went, classmates turned to look. Their expressions a mix of awe, curiosity, and even a touch of regret. The girl they had dismissed for so long was suddenly the center of attention. She solved it perfectly, someone whispered. Who knew she was a genius, another voice added, almost in disbelief. For years, Sarah had worked hard to stay in the background, to avoid moments like this. But now, for the first time, she didn't feel the familiar urge to shrink or disappear. She walked with her head held high, her heart lighter than it had ever felt before. The classroom had already emptied. But Mrs. Thompson lingered. Her usual stern demeanor softened. She caught up to Sarah just as she reached the school gates. Her steps brisk but hesitant. Sarah, Mrs. Thompson called out. Sarah stopped and turned, her grip tightening on her backpack straps. The teacher's face was uncharacteristically apologetic. Her usual confidence replaced by something quieter, almost vulnerable. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Thompson began, her voice steady but low. I underestimated you. And that was wrong. I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment. And I didn't see the incredible talent you were hiding. She paused, searching for the right words. You have a gift, Sarah. Don't ever let anyone, including me, make you feel like you need to hide it. For a moment, Sarah was speechless. The same teacher who had tried to humiliate her in front of the class was now standing here, acknowledging her brilliance. Thank you, Sarah said simply, her voice calm but filled with sincerity. As she turned back toward the horizon, Sarah felt a profound sense of closure. The weight of years spent hiding her true self had finally lifted. She wasn't running from her brilliance anymore. This experience had been about more than just solving an equation. It was about breaking free from the expectations and judgments that had kept her in the shadows. Sarah had realized that her fears of standing out had only held her back from embracing who she truly was. Her story is a reminder for all of us: you don't have to fit into the mold that others create for you. Embrace your unique talents and let the world see your light, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. As Sarah walked away, the whispers behind her no longer felt heavy or oppressive. They were just background noise. She was ready to step into the world not as someone hiding, but as someone who had finally found herself. Have you ever been underestimated? Maybe someone doubted your abilities or made assumptions about who you are without ever truly knowing you. How did that make you feel? And more importantly, what did you do to prove them wrong? Sarah's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest challenges we face aren't about proving ourselves to others, they're about breaking free from the limits we place on ourselves. She could have stayed quiet, continued to blend into the background, and let the world go on believing what it wanted. But she chose a different path. She chose to step forward, embrace her brilliance, and show everyone, including herself, what she was truly capable of. Now, it's your turn. What's one moment in your life when you defied expectations and showed the world who you really are? Or, if you're still waiting for that moment, what's holding you back? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And remember, your own Sarah moment could be just around the corner. You don't have to wait for permission to shine. Sometimes, all it takes is the courage to step up, even when the odds are stacked against you. If you found inspiration in Sarah's journey, don't forget to give this video a like and share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own potential. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us all of the incredible power we hold within ourselves. Thank you for watching. And until next time, remember, you are capable of greatness. Don't hide your light, let it shine.